Well, good morning, and I'm here with Dr. Tom Loveless. We are talking to the expert of experts on the whole issue of testing and test scores and that kind of thing. He was a sixth grade teacher, a Harvard policy public public policy professor, expert in student achievement, and he's going to tell us all about all of his different accomplishments, which are many. And then he's going to then after he does that, I'll get into the first question. So Dr. Lovelace, it's all you. I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you, Sam, for having me on. I really appreciate it. You asked me to tell a few words about myself. My career basically consists of three parts. I was a classroom teacher in public schools in Sacramento, California for about a decade. I did my teacher training at the end of the 1970s, and I taught most of the 1980s. Then I left the classroom to get a PhD. I studied curriculum and instruction with an emphasis on policy questions in curriculum and instruction. And after that, I taught at the Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. I taught education policy courses. And in 1999, I left Harvard and went to the Brookings Institution. And I was the director of the Brown Center on Education Policy at Brookings. That's in Washington, D.C. And I retired in 2014. I haven't really stayed that retired, but I don't have a boss. Yeah, I don't have a boss, I guess, is the way to put it. In 2014, and I've been writing and blogging ever since. So that's basically my bio.
Okay, thank you. Well, let's get into the first question. What are the important tests that teachers should pay attention to? Why are they important? You've indicated you're going to cover some of the large-scale assessments like the NAEP and others, and how they differ from state tests. So it's just kind of like, can you give us that background?
Yeah, so I'll give you a rundown of the various tests, and I'm sharing the wrong screen for some reason.
Okay, you just want to open up your PowerPoint.
Yeah, let me do that. Okay, and now I'll do share screen.
Okay. Don't you love technology? Do not answer that.
I do, but is it showing through now?
Okay.
Yeah. Very good. So I call these the big five tests, and the five tests that teachers should be concerned about. Now, the first four really have nothing to do with teachers. They are large-scale samples of students, and I like to think of them as a thermometer. And the reason why they're important is because they tell policymakers, and eventually classroom teachers are affected by policy. That's just the way it goes, whether you like it or not. But these are the tests that policymakers use to see how are kids doing in the United States. Now, the first one is NAEP, it's referred to. It's the National Assessment of Educational Progress. I've only put the acronyms down because the titles are so long and people won't remember them anyway, and it's irrelevant. People refer to these by their acronyms. So NAEP is our national assessment. It's often called the National Report Card. And there are actually two NAEPs. There's the long-term trend NAEP, which goes back to the late 60s. 1969 is the first time it was given. It was given in science. And then reading and math were given in the 70s. So we have data going back over 5 decades on the long-term trend NAEP. The other NAEP test is called the main NAEP, and it is more recent. It started in the 1990s, and it's a grade-based test. You can see it's given in grades 4, 8, and 12. The long-term trend that I just mentioned is an age-based test. And there's some overlap in these. So, for instance, the 9-year-olds, most of them are in 4th grade, but not all of them. And the same thing with 13-year-olds. Most of them are in 8th grade, but again, not all of them. Now, there are 2 international tests that are given. One is TIMSS. That's the oldest of the 2. The TIMSS test is given in math and science, and it's given every 4 years. It's administered. It started in 1995, but there are precursors to TIMSS, and I'm going to show you something on one of the very first international tests later, but there were precursors to TIMSS that go back to the 1960s. So we do have an idea of how the United States compares to other countries going back to the 1960s. The PISA test is a more modern test. It was first given in 2000. It's given to 15-year-olds, so it's a high school level test. In the United States, age 15 is about the fall of the sophomore year in high school. And it's given in reading, math, and science every 3 years. The Pearls test is just strictly a reading test. It's given to little kids, fourth graders, and it's given every 5 years. It began in 2001, and the last test was given during the pandemic in 2021. So those data are kind of shaky, the 2021 data. I don't put a lot of faith in them. Finally, there is the test that teachers are most familiar with, and that's every state has its own state tests. And there are accountability systems that are tied to those tests. In a few states, Mississippi is probably the most famous, there are retention laws so that if kids have to reach a certain level by the end of third grade when they take their state test, then they're allowed to go on to fourth grade. And if they are struggling mightily with reading, they could be subject to retention. Now, one of the big differences between these state tests and the other 4 tests that I've mentioned is the state tests are a census test, and that means everybody takes them. So in grades 3 through 8, all third graders in the state take the test, all fourth graders, all fifth graders, etc. These other tests that I've mentioned, they are not census tests. They are sample-based tests. So they're almost like a public opinion poll, where a selected sample is randomly chosen, and then the trends are deduced from that sample. So that's an important distinction between the state tests and these other tests. And by the way, another important distinction is these state tests are considered a high stakes test because there can be accountability that comes about because of the results. Schools can be held accountable, or districts can be held accountable. They generate scores at the state, district, school, and student levels. So parents get reports in the states as to how their kids are doing. And one big difference is all these other tests above the state tests that I mentioned, there are no stakes at all. So when the NAEP test is given, there aren't even scores generated for schools. There are for a few large urban districts, but there are no stakes attached to performance on NAEP, no stakes attached to performance on the rest of these sample tests. So that's a rundown of the tests. Like I said, they're important to teachers because policymakers notices, they take account of these tests, they cite them when they write legislation. So they are important to policymakers to figure out how are kids doing.
Hey, what a terrific explanation. And I know I have note takers like Mary Howard who are just going to be getting all that information down for everybody to look at. Now I'm trying.
I wanted to give you an idea of the most recent trends in terms of kids' achievement.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that was I was trying to get to that question.
Okay.
Technical difficulty on my end, but now I've got it straightened out. Okay, so I will ask my second question, which you were anticipating. Recent trends on major tests, the impact of the pandemic, the widening gap between low and high achievers. So if you could give us a rundown on that.
Yep. Now, this slide shows the long-term trend test, and I mentioned this is a NAEP test, age 13. It's an age-based test. It goes back to 1978, and you can see where the kids scored in 1978. These different lines represent different places in the distribution of achievement. This top line is the 90th percentile. So those are the highest achieving kids in the United States. They are in the top 10% of performers in the United States. The bottom line, on the other hand, are our lowest achieving kids. These are kids who really struggle with mathematics. They are in the bottom 10th percent in the United States. Now, this test was last given in 2023, so it was given this year, and the results were released just a week or two ago. And they made big headlines for showing the effect of the pandemic. The test in 2020, which was pre-pandemic, you can see here this last comparison of scores. You can see that even at the 90th percentile, the scores dropped from 329 to 322, a loss of 7 scale score points. And to give you an idea of how large that is, it's never been seen before. You can see across the whole history of the test, there's never been a drop of this dimension before. So, but one important thing to notice is the kids at the bottom of the distribution, the low achievers, they fell off a cliff during the pandemic. So they went from 228 to 213, a loss of 15 scale score points. You know, that's roughly twice as much as the kids at the top. So, bottom line here is the results of the pandemic hurt everybody. They hurt everybody across the distribution, but they hurt the kids at the bottom the most. Now, here's an interesting aspect to this trend. The trend of the widening between the high achievers and the low achievers was in place quite a while ago, 2012. So if you go back to 2012, you can see that the high achievers between 2012 and 2020, the kids at the 90th percentile, their scores are basically flat. But the low achievers, the kids in the bottom 10th percentile, they were falling already pre-pandemic. So it's almost as if the kids at the bottom had a cold before the pandemic, and then after the pandemic, they had pneumonia or something, you know, in terms of this widening gap. So since 2012, and by the way, we see this, I'm just using this particular test as an example. I don't want to go through all 10 of them.
Right.
And in reading and math, both, you know. But we see the same pattern in reading. We see the same pattern at other ages. We see the same pattern at other grade levels. So the bottom line here is we had pretty steady rising scores. And you'll notice at the bottom, they actually were rising the most between 1978 and 2012. But something happened around 2012. We don't know what that something was. A lot of people have speculated. These tests actually are not good as diagnostic tools, but they're very good for just telling it. They're like a thermometer. They tell us whether or not you have a fever. They don't tell you why you have a fever. You have to do further work to get at that. So that's where the most recent test scores, the trends have gone.
Okay. Now you said you wanted to do some myth debunking, and I think that's
Yes.
what my audience is the most interested in. And I'm going to give you A, B, and C all at once, and leave it to you. And then I might have a couple of things to ask at the end. The A1 is USA has always done poorly on international tests. There's never been a golden age. I'd like to speak to that because there are some groups out there claiming that, you know, we have this sudden ongoing crisis and have what is essentially a manufactured crisis, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But there's that. Proficient does not mean grade level. And oh my gosh, that is so important that we have some of these same groups out there saying that, you know, 2/3 of the kids or large numbers, huge numbers of the kids are not performing where we want them to be performing. And yet when you're going to speak to the idea that, maybe that's something of a, well, I'll let the expert talk about that. And generally scores have gone up in the past 50 years, especially in math. and the scores of younger students have been going up, especially non-white students. And that's not what we're hearing on the social media.
Right.
Just myths about what's being said on social media and what the actual trends are, and anything you care to share along those lines. And it's now all you again. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And yes, those are the three myths. I think those are the three biggest myths in K-12 education. And I've reordered them slightly to talk about proficient first. But so I'll talk about proficient does not mean grade level. It does not. And everybody gets that confused. There are reporters who cover test scores, and I probably see almost every day on Twitter or somewhere somebody referring to the percentage of kids who scored below proficient, which is around 2/3, as being below grade level. Proficient is not grade level. It's much higher than grade level. So let me talk a little bit about that. The US has never scored at the top of international tests. It's always scored near the bottom, at best in the middle. So there never was a golden age when the US dominated testing. American kids don't do well on these international tests. And then finally, test scores, the idea they've declined is simply false. They've gone up, actually. As I mentioned, we have data going back over 5 decades. They've gone up. They've gone up more for Black and Hispanic students and for Asian students than for white students. Of the big racial ethnic groups, white students have actually lagged in terms of their gains, but all groups have gained. So let me first deal with the proficient question, the question of proficient. And I want to take our viewers back to 2011. So in 2011, the state of Florida took the PEARLS test, and that's one of the tests I mentioned at the beginning. So this is fourth graders in Florida. They only gave the PEARLS they participated, in other words, as if they were a country. This is an international test. And Florida said, we've been doing a lot of things in reading, and we want to see how we compare to other countries. And so they took the PEARLS test. Here's how they did. They did fantastic. They actually scored at the top of the world league tables. And here's how the federal government, National Center of Educational Statistics, described the Florida performance. No education system scored higher than Florida. 4 were not measurably different. So Florida was in a statistical tie with 4 other countries, and 48 scored lower. So again, Florida scored right at the top. Here are the scale scores. The PEARLS average is 500. The United States as an entire nation scored 556, which is quite good, by the way. I mean, that's 56 points above. This little asterisk means it is significantly above the international average. And here's the state of Florida that scored even higher than that. So Florida, bottom line here is Florida did very well on the PEARLS test.
Remind us one more time the year we're talking about here.
2011. We're talking about 2011. And I selected that year for a purpose, and that was to show that proficient does not mean grade level, because Florida also took part in the NAEP that year. And here's the breakdown of the percentage of kids who scored at advanced, at proficient, at basic, and below basic. Those are the 4 NAEP categories. You'll see that in the state of Florida, and don't forget, it just led the world in terms of reading. These are fourth graders in Florida, and they look terrible when you look at proficient and advanced. It's only 35% who scored proficient and advanced. How can you possibly lead the world in reading and only have 35% of proficient and advanced? And the answer to that question is the cut point for proficient, the point between proficient and basic, is set at a very high level, an extremely high level. It's around the 75th percentile, basically. So it does capture performance of the top quarter of students, but to say that you have to be in the top quarter of students to be performing at grade level is something no country in the world has ever achieved. So that's how I would illustrate how proficient does not mean grade level at all.
Could you go back to that slide for just a moment and indulge
Sure.
me by saying, okay, so what is the truth of this then? How many of our students are actually doing okay? What's that percent? And would I be correct in adding the 34, the 24, and the 8 to get that, or the 36 and the? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do see what you're saying. What I always look at is this below basic. So I look at the below basic because it identifies kids who are struggling. NAEP is not great at separating out these kids above below basic. But if you look at below basic, you have a third of the kids in the United States in fourth grade. This, again, 2011. And by the way, this test was just given recently. And it's always about the same. It's about a third who are below basic. A third of our students we need to be concerned about. And NAEP is good at identifying that percentage of students. But as far as being at grade level or below grade level or above grade level, it's not very good at that. It's very good at both ends of the distribution. The below basic kids truly do have reading problems. So it's around a third. In the state of Florida, it was 29% back in 2011. And it's very good at identifying the kids who are just superb readers. They're almost like adults in terms of their reading ability. And that's 8% of the United States. So that I hope answers your question.
Well, would I be incorrect in saying that about 2/3 of the kids then are performing at a reasonable level, something that would be educationally acceptable?
Yes.
Okay, that's
Yes.
what I was looking for. Thank
Yeah, I consider basic and above as being educationally acceptable. It doesn't mean the kids at basic are the same as the kids at advanced. You know, we're grouping these kids together across a very large continuum. But yes, they can read. The idea that they're non-readers or they're illiterate is absurd. It's not true.
you. Thank you. Okay,
Yeah.
proceed.
The next myth has to do with the United States performance on international tests. So these data here are from the first international math study. The acronym it goes by is FIMS, F-I-M-S. And it was the first international math study where we really had reliable data for countries. 12 countries participated. And since it's the first one, there was no other one before it. And let's see how the United States did on the very first math test. Now, this happens to be with 13-year-olds. They called them population 1B. I won't get into that. But the international average, the test itself had 40 items. This is just the number of items that were answered correctly. This is a math test. The international average was 23. Here's the standard deviation for people who are interested in that. Now, take a look at where the United States is out of the 12 countries. It is next to last. Only Sweden scored below the United States. The United States scored, the average was 17.8 items correct. So the idea that somehow the United States once did great on international tests, this is the first one that's scientifically defensible because of its sampling. The United States did quite poorly, and actually we do better today. We're closer to the average in math and science than we were in the 1960s. This test was given in 1964, 5, and 6. It took a long time to give these international tests. And then in 1967, the results came out. And take a look at the headline in the Washington Post. Poor U.S. math showing didn't surprise experts. And I remember when Arne Duncan was Secretary of Education, some international scores came out, and he said this should be a wake-up call because the United States scored around average. And I said, and I gave a talk the next day, and I said, wake-up call? I mean, we had our wake-up call in 1967. We should be wide awake by now. So, and the experts weren't surprised at that point by the poor U.S. showing. And take a look at the Washington Post in the article. See if I can blow this up a little bit. Although the study made public last week did not attempt to plumb the reasons why such countries as Japan and England outscore the United States, mathematical scholars say they are not difficult to perceive. And this is speculation again, but it's reasonable speculation. The experts assert that teachers here are not as well trained, and math teachers in most other countries around the world are better trained than our math teachers in the United States, and that neither American students nor the society at large places as much value on mathematics achievement as do many countries abroad. And I think that's a key issue, the cultural influence in terms of how much the society actually values math achievement matters in this regard.
I want to bring up one other point about possible reasons. And on the one hand, what you're saying, teachers make more difference than programs. That's something that I think, at least my take on the research, kind of affirms that. But there's another factor here in that who takes part in these tests. That in European countries, there are some children who would not be in the pool because of the way their education system is structured. And there are some kids who are in the U.S. pool would not be in their pool. Or am I incorrect in saying that might have some influence?
Not in this case, because all of that is taken into account. When this is actually the precursor of TIMS, so you can consider this like a TIMS test. And what you just said is taken into account. So European countries and the Asian countries, they are sampled across all children.
Okay.
When these tests are given. So there's no difference. Your statement is correct. The structure of the systems differ, but all kids are eligible to be tested and are selected. So that's not a factor in skewing the results here.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. The training part, I think, is important, the teacher training part. And most of European and Asian countries, the teachers who teach math have a degree in mathematics. They studied math in college, and that's not true in the United States, especially in elementary. It's rare to have a teacher who majored in math. And even at the middle school level, we have teachers teaching algebra who didn't take a lot of math in college. And that would never happen in a lot of Asian and European countries. So let me go to the next slide, which has to do with this idea that test scores are declining, and especially among Black and Hispanic students, when the opposite is true. Test scores have been going up. Now, I mentioned we have NAEP data going back 50 years. Shaquille and Peterson took all of that NAEP data and all of the TIMS data and all of the PEARLS data and all of the PISA data, and they combined it and said, what can we say about how well kids have learned math and reading over the last 5 decades? And here's what they found. Now I'm showing the math portion. I'll page down to the reading in just a second. First of all, they divided the kids into 3 groups: elementary grade students, middle grade students, and high school grade students. And over the years from 1971 to 2017, so it's 46 years, at the elementary level in mathematics, this is broken out by race and ethnicity. Here's the gain by white students, 0.28 standard deviations. Here's the gain by Hispanics. Here's the gain by Blacks, which you can see now we're going up in terms of the size of the gain. And here's the gain by Asian students. So you can see all groups of elementary racial and ethnic groups gain scores. They've gained in mathematical knowledge. If you got in a time machine and went back to 1971 and gave a kid a math test, you'd find out they know much less math than the kids of today. The kids of today know a lot more math. These are the gains per decade. Here's at the middle school level, you can see again, white students lag the other major racial ethnic groups, but Blacks and Hispanics very solid gains, about a quarter of a standard deviation. And by the way, 0.25 is considered about one grade level, to get back to this grade level idea. So Blacks and Hispanics at the middle school level have gained about a year in terms of their knowledge of mathematics. And here's the high school level. Now notice the high school level lags the younger kids. The youngest kids have the largest gains, middle school second largest, but then the high school kids, they have not done as well. And so a test like PISA, for example, which is an international test of high school kids, usually shows that kind of pattern as well. Now here are the reading scores. Again, elementary kids, solid gains across the board, especially by Asian, Black, and Hispanic students. White students have lagged. And here are middle school and finally high school pattern.
I'm going to ask you to one more time remind us of the time frame that this represents from
1971 to 2017. They published this paper in 2021. And you can find an article written for the lay public in the journal Education Next, where they explain all this.
I would love for you to send me that link, and I'll make
sure. I will.
But this certainly, it doesn't fit narratives that I'm hearing out there. But now that would be stealing your thunder to say that. So I'll just be quiet.
No, but you're absolutely right. And people think scores have been declining. They have not been declining. They've been going up. They've been declining, as I just showed earlier. They've been declining during the pandemic. They've been declining since 2012, but they haven't been declining over the last 40, 50 years. They've been going up. And they've been going up more for students of color than they have for white students.
Boy, that is so different from what we hear in the press and what we hear in social media.
Yep. So that's what I have in terms of data to debunk those three myths that I mentioned.
Okay, well, this has been enlightening, to say the least. And I know my friend Mary Howard is going to be taking careful notes on this and sharing them. So I have an idea that section that we just went over is going to be highlighted. If you could stop the share screen now, and I want to go into a couple of my own questions. You've answered most of them, but in term, I'm just looking to the story being told in the media and by social media that we've been in a crisis. We're in a crisis. The scores are going down and not up, and the rest. So is that a myth? Is that an accurate story, or is there a different story here that the actual data is showing? And this is data from across 5 decades. So just your opinion on, is there a reading crisis really, or exactly, is there a reading crisis in the manner that's being portrayed in social media?
Not the way it's being portrayed in social media. There is certainly a crisis among a third of the kids who are, by 4th grade, should have a firm grasp of basic reading, which includes both decoding and comprehension, and includes knowledge building so that they can read in the other disciplines, science and history in particular, and gain knowledge, and they're not able to read well enough to really do that. So for a third of children, they don't read as well as they need to be reading. I'll leave it to others to describe that as a crisis or not, but it's certainly an unacceptable phenomenon. However, to place that in perspective, and that's what I've tried to do today, that number has always been a third or even larger. So it was larger than a third in 1992, for example, when the NAEP test was given. it was larger than a third who scored below basic. I think it was 37%, maybe 40%. So there has been improvement. The improvement has been baby steps. But there's been improvement in reducing the numbers of kids who really struggle with reading. On social media, the distortions come from, I think, one of the main sources are advocacy groups, and they need to make the problem as dramatic as they possibly can in order to marshal support for their cause. And they tend to exaggerate the state of the problem. So yes, there's a problem. It's not as large as the advocates make it out to be. And one reason why that's important is I mentioned it's a third of kids who really struggle with reading. Our policies should be targeting that population and should be pinpointing those kids and offering relief to those kids. If you think, Nick Kristof had an article in the New York Times where he talked about 2/3 of the kids reading below grade level. Well, if you think that, you're going to design all your policies to target 2/3 of the kids because they're all below grade level. And that's not true. And that's not what we should be doing. It'd be like having, food stamps for all. Food stamps should be targeted to people who are struggling to put food on the table. So it's important to get the facts right. And unfortunately, you're right. Social media has not helped in this regard. It's hurt.
Hey, what a perfect way to end this talk. But I always give folks a chance at the very, very end. Anything we left out or anything more you'd like to say before we say goodbye?
Okay, I'd just say I'll go back to the analogy I used. Test scores are not a diagnostic tool; they're a thermometer. They tell you if you have a fever, but you need to look into it further to figure out what's causing that fever if you happen to have one. So, test scores are important, but they shouldn't be misused.
Boy, what a perfect way to wrap it up. Now, I have a silly thing to do next, and I'm going to change my view so that we're back to the gallery. And I always end my blogs with a Zoom wave goodbye. So we're both going to just do that in a moment and say goodbye to our audience. And this has been so informative. I feel like I should get a graduate credit or something in statistics for having gone through this. And I thought I knew statistics a little bit. And now, thanks to you, I know it a lot better than I did 10 or 20 minutes ago or 30 minutes ago. So thank you for that. And now it's time for our Zoom wave goodbye. So say goodbye to the audience.
Goodbye.
Thank you so much. I so appreciate your doing this.
Thank you, Sam.